What's up, guys? Welcome back to episode 2 of Saving the World. This is going to be a much shorter video on fears of our founding fathers, which I think is super important, just to look back at their warnings and what they said overall. So Federalist number 10 is an essay written by James Madison, the father of our Constitution, as part of the Federalist Papers, which was a series of essays arguing for the ratification of the United States Constitution. It was first published in November 1787. Paraphrasing quite a bit here, but part of what he says is, different factions will always exist in all societies. There will always be different opinions and values. Diversity of perspective is a strength, not a weakness. And we need space to resolve our disagreements and to find agreement on policies we can all live with, even if we don't love them. The framers of the United States Constitution were the delegates who drafted the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Constitution's framers participated in the Constitutional Convention as delegates and contributed to the document's drafting. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and obviously George Washington are traditionally recognized as the principal founding fathers. These guys are geniuses. Much of what they wrote and surmised we still live and abide by today, and their writings laid the foundation for the stability of the United States for the last 240 years. I will argue in a future video that it took about 210 years, bringing us all the way to the 1990s, for modern 21st century politicians to really start mucking it up. The framers in the 1780s basically were all in agreement that parties appeared as a mortal danger to the young republic. James Madison wrote that different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power would, in turn, divide mankind into parties and inflame them with mutual animosity. Crisis happens, he wrote, when the state is violently heated and distracted by the rage of party. John Adams wrote in 1780 that he worried that a division of the republic into specifically two great parties is to be dreaded as the great political evil. George Washington's farewell address in 1796 warned of the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, which he believed at that time was natural to party dissension. He went on to specify that in many different ages and many countries, that this dynamic has perpetrated the most horrid enormities. He warned about the founding of parties based on geographical discrimination. He warned that citizens of each region would live and talk politics among only fellow partisans, reinforcing their shared grievances against the other. Madison and Washington, who eventually disagreed on a lot of things, as Madison decided to side more with Thomas Jefferson, both especially feared parties organized along geographical lines. Rather than fluid coalitions that grouped and regrouped based on specific issues, geographical parties would represent more permanent divides based on identities, which would grow fixed and violent in their opposition. Washington's farewell address has been read in the House of Delegates on Washington's birthday from 1899 up until 1984, and it continues to be read annually in the U.S. Senate. Since the Civil War in the 1860s, Democrats and Republicans have been the two dominant parties. These two parties are now older than most of the world's democracies. For most of their history, though, they were incredibly broad, vague, amorphous national coalitions. This meant that they rarely stood for much at the national level. They didn't have a brand that aligned with certain policies. They didn't aim to consistently appeal to the same specific classes, divisions, or culture groups. This vagueness lent a certain stability to 20th century American political competition. Parties were too fluid to do what the framers feared they would do, which was divide the country into two warring halves, each claiming to be the majority. Fast forward all the way to 1942 to a book titled Party Government by Elmer Schattschneider. Elmer was president of the American Political Science Association, the APSA, and taught at Columbia, the New Jersey College for Women, and Wesleyan University for 30 years. The Schattschneider Award, named in his honor, is now awarded annually by the APSA to honor the best doctoral dissertation in the field of American government. Elmer drew comfort in the 1940s from the observation that though many conflicts existed, they were not cumulative. He writes, whatever fears the framers might have had about political parties hardening into permanent majority and minority factions, that these dire predictions had not materialized. He writes, in real life, the divisions are not so clearly marked, and the alignment of people according to interest requires an enormous shuffling back and forth from one side to the other, tending to dissipate the tensions created. Schattschneider acknowledged the danger that if this fluid conflict were ever instead to become reinforcing, which echoed Washington and Madison's concerns. He writes, if individuals who join hands on one occasion were to find themselves on the same side of all issues, always opposed to the same combination of antagonists, the split created by the cumulative effect of these divisions would be fatal. He was also on point with how identity politics could worsen inequalities by shifting the conflict. He writes, the substitution of conflicts is the most devastating kind of political strategy. Fast forward to 1960, Schattschneider gives one of his most explicit warnings and writes that the people are powerless if the political enterprise is not competitive. Unfortunately, it is very clear that although it took as many as 210 to 240 years to manifest this full-blown, toxic two-party conflict, we have undoubtedly arrived in our founding fathers' nightmares. I urge you to subscribe to this channel so we can continue digging deeper for answers on what went wrong in this country, why it's happening, and what we can do to help. Stay tuned.